Hey everyone, welcome back to French Creek Farmhouse. I'm Kristi.
And I'm Rob.
And it is dahlia planting time. This is the second video of our dahlia planting. The first one that we just posted recently was about the 30 varieties that we're going to be growing this year, which is roughly 400 plants. And now we're actually planting them in the ground. So if you want to learn how we're doing it, this is the video to watch. I will say though, as a caveat, that if you have not watched our Season 2 opener video where we talked about starting our cut flower farm, specifically we grow dahlias, you might want to go back and watch that because this is not meant to be instructional exactly. We are experimenting with a lot of the things that we're doing. So some of the methods that we're trying out, we don't know whether or not they're going to work.
So for example, this is the first year we're using raised beds.
That's right. In the past, we've planted our dahlias in the ground, and we thought this might be a better solution for us for a number of reasons. One is the fact that they're a little bit better contained in this space, more defined space between the rows and walkways. It's up off the ground a little bit, which makes it easier for us to work at versus being on our hands and knees when we're doing the planting. Because we are growing so many plants, it makes it a little bit easier. We also thought that harvesting would be easier because that certainly was a bit of a challenge last year when we were digging things out after the first frost. It's cold and rainy and miserable, and we thought in raised beds that process might go a little bit faster. We don't totally know if this is going to work, so it's a little bit of an experiment, but we're going for it. And in this bed we have both tubers and rooted cuttings. You can see that we have some rooted cuttings already planted in this bed, and I'll be showing you one more that I'm about to plant just so that you can see the process, which isn't really different than planting out tubers, except that they do require water, and tubers don't want to be watered until they're established and the plant has come up out of the ground. So you want to avoid that so that you don't rot the tuber out. But rooted cuttings require water. They don't have a tuber. All they have are these tiny little roots, and the only way for this plant to survive is to make sure it gets plenty of water and food. So this will be the first one that I am planting today, and I'll show you how I'm doing it. We're going to plant it just so that the soil goes up to the first set of leaves, and you can also go a little bit past. You could bury the first set of leaves if you want to. I'm not. I'm just going to go right up to them. So I'm digging a hole about 3 or 4 inches deep, which is more than I'm going to need for this tiny little sprout. And then I'm going to add a couple of tablespoons of bone meal to the bottom of the planting hole. Bone meal really helps feed these little guys, and you just want to mix it in really well. If the smell bothers you, you might want to wear a mask. I always recommend wearing a mask when you're using any of these products. Even though they're organic, you're still breathing them in, and it's not such a great thing. So rooted cuttings come in these little plastic containers, and all you need to do to remove them is to carefully grip the base of the plant. Maybe give the bottom just a little bit of a push with your thumb and pinch the sides, and it'll slide right out. This is rooted into rooting medium, which is kind of like a little foam sponge, and you can leave it on the plant itself. It'll be totally fine. Just backfill the soil. Lightly firm the plant so it's secure in the hole. Make sure the soil is evenly distributed around, and then make sure to label the plant so that you know what you've got here later. That's as simple as it is for planting the rooted cuttings. So now we're moving on to tubers, and Rob and I both have Snohomish that we're working on, which is one of the varieties in this bed. This bed is all about varieties that we are working on cultivating stock. Our normal, what we consider full stock, we talked about in our last video, is 25 plants, at least 25 plants of any one variety. Less than that, and we see that we have trouble making bouquets because we don't have enough stems from week to week of a certain variety. So we try to do at least 25 plants But with some of these really hard to find varieties, we're building up our stock with maybe, for example, with Snohomish, we're only going to have 8 plants this year, but we should be at full stock level next year if everything goes as planned. So let's get these tubers in the ground. So our raised beds are 4 feet across and they're about a foot deep. So that is what we're planning this year, is that gives us room for 3 rows technically. So 1 row straight down the middle and then 1 row 18 inches apart from the center. So that is a recommended spacing, is 12 to 18 inches. So we'll do 18 inches apart on the rows and 12 inches apart every plant. It is tight spacing. Probably most home gardeners aren't going to use this kind of spacing. We do plant very intensively. Last year we were a little more conservative, and we found in some beds, we planted some beds further apart and some beds closer together to try to see how they would do. And the ones that we planted at 12-inch by 18-inch spacing performed far better than the plants that we planted further apart in terms of how they grew, how quickly they grew. So we kind of think this is the best spacing for us, but of course this is all trial and error, and last year might not dictate what this year does, so we're continuing on and trying this out. So tubers, you plant the same way we planted the rooted cuttings. I mean, you're digging a hole, amending it with bone meal, but tubers want to be planted, we plant ours about 4 to 5 inches deep. People will say anywhere from 3 to 6, so we're kind of like snug in the middle there at 4 to 5 inches. So just dig a nice sized hole. And if your shovel has markings on it, that's really nice, like mine does. It tells me, you know, easily I can see when I'm at the proper planting depth. And I add a little bit more bone meal to the tubers than I do to the rooted cuttings. We use these old leftover plastic cups from making, that comes in our smoothie powder. And since every new container has a new cup inside, when I hated just throwing them away every time, so I started using them for garden purposes, and they're great little scoops for scooping out fertilizers. We are using an organic bone meal, and we've used different varieties in the past. I don't think it particularly makes much of a difference, but we only use organic, OMRI organic products with our plants. So just plop the bone meal right down in there and then mix it around. So once you get a 4 to 5 inch deep hole, the tuber should be planted horizontally with the eye facing up. These have already started to sprout, which is not a big deal, and these sprouts aren't the healthiest. They're probably gonna fall off and it'll send up new ones. It's not a big deal. So just plant it horizontally with that eye facing up, and they'll find their way to the surface. Even if you planted them with the eye facing the wrong direction, it's not gonna be a problem. It'll find its way. And then backfill, and you're good. We're having a little bit of a problem with field mice in our raised beds. We did not put any sort of mesh down on the bottom of the beds, just because it would have been incredibly cost prohibitive for us for the number of beds that we have and how many feet we would be covering. And we weren't sure if raised beds were going to be the best solution for us long term, so these are definitely trial and error beds. We may end up tearing them down and building something different. We may go back to just straight in-ground planting. It kind of, you know, remains to be seen. So we didn't want to invest in doing, we would have needed to do a finer, like a hardware cloth sort of thing to keep those guys out, because chicken wire, they can go right through because they can squeeze through the sides of the holes. So we didn't want to invest in that cost for this year.
And I was just gonna say, even though it's only, these beds are only about a foot higher off the ground, it makes such a big difference doing this work, where you can sit, you can kneel, but you're not, you know, putting all your weight down underneath you as you're trying to dig down and plant these. I mean, when you're doing that for hours upon hours, even have this little foot extra height, it made such a big difference, I think.
Yeah, it definitely makes a huge difference in terms of when you do have to weed. And so that's another good point. People probably are wondering why we have these nets on our beds. We last year did not net any of our dahlias, and we didn't have a widespread issue, but what we found with netting is that it cuts down on the number of weed seeds that are getting into the beds in the first place, so we don't have to weed as often. Last year, we didn't have too big of a weed problem. We had deer come and graze. Deer generally don't like dahlias, but they decided to graze some of ours, and it's kind of heartbreaking when that happens because it sets them back quite a ways, and we wanted to prevent that this year. Also, in the past, we've planted our dahlias into landscape fabric, and that worked great. It definitely worked for the weeds. It made it so much easier, and we do plant a lot of our other crops into landscape fabric as well. We aren't doing that this year, so that's another reason why netting them, you know, they'll be able to get like 3 feet tall before we have to take the nets off. By that point, these plants will be well established. Some of them will be almost mature, and we won't have to worry as much about losing any of them. Their leaves will fill out and provide enough cover that we won't have to worry about the weeds down below, because they won't be able to get enough sunlight. So there's a lot of advantages to this method, we think, and it's definitely, you know, it's an experiment. We netted all of our other cut flower beds as well, and it worked really well in terms of not having to do as much weeding. And we only netted them until the point where the plants were big enough that they're shading out the possibility for any weeds to grow down below. Okay, so today is day 2, and you might be able to tell from my face that we didn't get a lot of sleep last night. We're pretty tired. It's early in the morning right now. We're trying to get work done before it gets warmer. Just makes things a lot easier. We have 2 more beds left to plant, and we still need to amend the soil for those. So what we do is we add in Biotone starter fertilizer. It's an organic fertilizer, and it just helps start plants. It's not meant for ongoing fertilization, but it's good when you're first planting. So we're going to be amending 2 of the beds. It's the dirty job. It's the thing we really dislike the most. We have to wear masks, and so it is much better to do it when it's kind of cold and misty out right now than when it's warmer in the day. So we'll get some fertilizer down, re-level those beds, and then we'll be able to start planting the rest of the dahlias. So as you guys can see, this is not, the most fun activity to be doing. It's kind of backbreaking work, and it's certainly easier when we plant it in ground because we would just put the fertilizer down and then till it into the beds with machinery, versus this way we're having to do it by hand. So there's some pros and cons, and this is all kind of a figuring out process. We're seeing a lot of advantages with planting in raised beds, but then this is certainly one of the disadvantages, is having to do some of this work by hand. But we're almost done. Before we start planting, one of the first things that we always do is grid our bed. The tool that we use to do that, I've linked down below in this description, but it's a simple way to show where the square foot markings are in the bed and to know exactly where you want to plant. So working on planting these tuber clumps, and when you get clumps like this, we talked about this in a previous video, but you have to clean them up first, and so you have to cut all these broken tubers off of the clump, otherwise they'll just rot in the ground. And so what we do is we have 2 pairs of snips, and they're in bleach water, which is like a 10% bleach solution, and we just swap back and forth between clumps so that way we don't have any possibility of spreading any disease. And you just go along and trim up the clump, knock off the tubers that aren't going to do anything for you, and like some of these old feeder roots that are from last season, those can all be cut off as well. So I'm cleaning up clumps while Rob is planting. It kind of makes it go a little bit faster when we do these. I think planting single tubers is a little bit easier because they're already ready to go and ready to go in the ground. But we're at the point of the season where we're in that limbo stage. So once the tubers go in the ground, it's like 2 to 3 weeks before they start to sprout, depending on the variety. And it's a big time of uncertainty, of like waiting to see what's going to happen. I mean, it's just, they go into the ground and then it's waiting. They'll come up or they won't come up. So, that time of uncertainty brings up a lot of conversations for us about that topic in general. And since we're kind of having one this morning, we thought, why not talk about it with you guys too? So I think the big thing that we were talking about is that the idea of uncertainty being, uncomfortable, it equals discomfort in our lives, right? And our brains are really hardwired for keeping us safe. And when we experience this sort of, ambiguity, your brain kind of subconsciously determines that there's a threat, even if there's not a threat present. And it leads you to those sort of anxious feelings. And I think most people try to counter that is by trying to control the direction of things. But the reality is, in life, there's like this small amount of stuff that is within our control, and there's this like vast range of stuff that we have no control over whatsoever. And so, like what we're doing, in terms of like, using care to clean up our tubers and, prevent the spread of disease, and using our nets to help, reduce weed pressure and pest pressure and things like that, that stuff is within our control. But there's so much in any type of farming, no matter what the crop is, that's outside of our control, that, leaves us feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think, that's normal with anything,
for me at least, I always try to want to be whatever I'm trying to do and be successful. I'm always trying to make sure I can control all the variables, we do. I think that's part of doing this is doing everything as correctly and as possible, and kind of making sure everything's done the way it should be. But as Kristi just said, there's times where you've done everything, and now you have to kind of just leave it to faith and believe you did the best you can, and you can only control so many things, and then just see what happens. And that is super hard, because you don't have that control, and you have to just say, okay, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I did what I could. Now let's just see what the results are.
And if we try to avoid that uncertainty, then it only leads to pain in your life. I mean, not just the anxiety, but different versions of trying to numb the way that you feel, numb out that discomfort. And so, I think, a lot of people recognize like emotional eating, right? Food is a great way to numb how you feel, or, alcohol or shopping, or, even things that like you could perceive as technically being a healthy activity, like working out, going to the gym or something like that. I mean, those things, it depends on your intention of why you're doing it, right? So if you're doing it for the intention of avoiding the uncomfortable feelings, then it's not a healthy behavior ultimately. But if you're instead, trying to soothe the way that you're feeling, acknowledge how you're feeling, and then look for ways to comfort yourself, and that's a different story. So it's all about your intentions.
The way I think about it a lot of times is when you're doing a situation, like going to the gym or surfing on the internet, that stuff, there's a lot of positive with that. The question is, are you doing it mindlessly?
Yeah.
Where you're not really thinking about it, you're just kind of getting numbing, and just so you're not feeling things because you're anxious about what you can't control? Or are you doing those things with mindfulness and kind of being present in the moment and trying to do self-care and those things? It's a small difference, but I think it kind of dictates on kind of the healthiness factor of that whatever behavior you are doing at that moment.
Yeah, so I think the only way to really kind of move through some of this, and we've had to talk a lot about this, is just getting to that place of like acceptance, right? And acceptance doesn't mean that you like the discomfort that you're feeling, or you like what's going on around you, the experience. It means that you're meeting life where it is. You're not trying to control. You acknowledge that this is what's happening, and then you can be more proactive, and you can be more like solutions oriented. But Rob says this often, like that you have to feel your feelings, right? The only way out is through, and so that's a big piece of it. So that mindless numbing, ultimately it doesn't work, because it just prolongs you being in that state of not acknowledging and not accepting the experiences that are going on in your life.
Yeah, and it's about feeling what it is to feel kind of like this is uncomfortable, not knowing what's going to happen, whatever it is, whether it's you're waiting to see what comes up from the soil that you planted something, or is it waiting to hear back from the job interview you just did. It's uncomfortable, or you feel anxious or nervous, and all those things. Is just about sitting with it and really and feeling it and going through it, and that's typically the best way.
Yeah, because I think like people would think like the opposite of uncertainty is certainty, but that's not true. The opposite of uncertainty is mindfulness, right? And that awareness and acceptance of the present, of your feelings, and using mindfulness in healthy ways, right? So the difference between mindless numbing to try to not feel something versus mindful self-care, comforting yourself versus avoidance, and acknowledging that thoughts aren't facts. There's a lot of thoughts that we have, but that doesn't mean that that's the truth. And then I think the big one that we talk about quite a bit for us is gratitude. and there's really always something to be grateful for, and that can, gratitude can remarkably reduce that feeling of anxiety and uncertainty.
So I think with gratitude, it's like having that, when you take the moment and you start recognizing and pointing out and the things that you were really grateful for, it kind of changes, I think, a little bit your mind, your focus, the energy you're giving out. And I think that's partially why it really kind of helps with all those other strong emotions going on.
Yeah, I agree. And this whole farming adventure that we're on, and if you haven't gone back and watched our season 2 opener just to see what exactly it is that we're trying to do here, definitely go watch that. But this adventure is just loaded with uncertainty for us. I mean, every aspect of it right now, because we are completely figuring this out as we go. We are dealing with this absolutely on a daily basis. And if we don't tend to some of these feelings, dealing with uncertainty and not getting overly anxious about stuff, and failure is almost inevitable, because we will get stuck in this place of paralysis. We won't be able to go forward if we don't sort of grapple with these things. And that's why we have these conversations with each other a lot when we're sitting and doing work, because getting that mindset is such a big piece of the job, of the work of life, but especially with what we're doing right now.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how the things in just everyday life, it all just kind of repeats itself here on the farm. And so all those challenges, no matter what job you have, it kind of just repeats itself. And it's kind of the cool thing about life. And it's about being human.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed this video, we hope that you will like it, maybe share it if you want, subscribe to our channel, and also be sure to hit that little notification bell, because that will keep you updated whenever we post something new. We're really happy to have you guys along on this journey with us, even though we are really figuring it out as we go. But we think that we're doing something that fills us up and has meaning, and we want to see where it goes. So we really appreciate you guys sticking with us, and we'll see you next time. You look like you're in a canoe.
We're like opposite canoes. You go
Yeah.
the other way. The other way.
Canoe
We're
race.
spinning around.